doesn't work. These diseases will continue to kill people, and there will be no way that we can stop them or help them. These places will have overwhelming health problems, which will devastate those countries, and I cannot overstate the risk at which something like superbugs and resistances to antibiotics can actually cripple entire nations. We think that this is going to look like things like the Ebola crisis writ large. We're going to see massive public health problems. Even if the harms are not as significant as that, and they can be controlled and Pharma can somehow keep up with the development of superbugs, we think that the financial cost to those countries of having to bear that is going to significantly continue to harm them. We think the deaths that those people suffer are on the heads of those governments, and those governments can and need to be stopped by any means necessary. 2, we think that a significant problem is that the mutations that occur from exposure to overuse of antibiotics often lead to diseases which are not initially lethal, becoming so. So the rise of diseases which are currently, while debilitating, not going to kill you, becoming significantly more damaging because they have to develop more powerful and become more destructive as a result of their exposure to antibiotics. We think that that is a significant harm. But furthermore, those diseases then spread to nations around these countries and others in the world, and those nations at no point opted in to the destruction of their people as a result of superbugs that they could not control. We think that's a crippling harm in this debate. But thirdly, we think in the long term, the use of these things in industrial services, such as agriculture and such as industry, mean that you have massive economic, ecological and environmental damage. So that's things like in 10 years, farming communities no longer actually being able to grow anything because the ground is so utterly destroyed by the use of pharmaceuticals in order to allow crops to grow effectively. That sounds great when your crop is currently immune from diseases. It's going to be much less great in 10 years when the ground is so destroyed by that it's no longer possible for these countries to have an agricultural sector. This is a crisis of short-termism. The World Trade Organization must act. To summarize those benefits and what we bring you from opening government then. 1, we think that there is a crucial messaging effect to these countries that will inevitably tell them that this is a severe problem and they must act. But 2, the very obvious reason why we think this policy will immediately and clearly succeed, and most countries will act on this before they even have these sanctions imposed, is that the obvious harm of not having any access to antibiotics and the huge response from their people will obviously incentivize them to act immediately. These countries have these short-term bias. The moment we give them a short-term problem, they will reform. We think that they will understand this and they will act appropriately. The vast majority of this effect will be deterrent, but also we are happy to ensure that they change. We think that there is an ongoing crisis. We think that the world must act. The World Health Organization is the ones to do this.
Thank you very much. Now, if I could first speak in opposition.
Let us be very clear what the model proposed by opening government looks like. It looks like the developing nations bearing the costs in the real time and in the now for threats that may accrue in the future. It looks like risking having your crops destroyed by pests so you may prevent some sort of ecological disaster in the future. It looks like the cost of your people dying from preventable diseases so that you may prevent superbugs in the future. A couple of things are really important to note in this debate. Firstly, the problems that are posed by opening government are already being solved by the West. In the West, we are already tightening the regulations of prescriptions that are preventing things like superbugs, and we are already developing new strains of antibodies to fight ones that have already been resistant. That governments in the West have huge incentives in order to be able to try to fix those problems that unfortunately are just currently not available to governments in developing countries. Because the costs that accrues to governments in developing countries are real, cannot afford to be paid for, and it is unjust and unfair to ask them to be able to do so. What we stand for inside opposition is continued support by the WHO to increase the capacity of these developing nations, to increase their medical powers and bureaucracies, to get to a point where they incentives now align with the West, where you can afford to deal with these existential threats in the future. The way doing that is not by punitive action, but through continued support. Point in principle and then a couple of impacts. Firstly, why we don't think developing nations owe any sort of obligation to try to fight these crises. The first thing to note here is that these problems, like antibody resistance, were not caused by developing countries. They were caused by the kinds of overprescribing and the continuous use of antibodies that happens in the West. And the reason that we know to do this is that in order to be able to create a problem like a superbug in the first place, you need to be quite wealthy. You need to be using antibodies so much that these bugs develop a resistance to it. That is only accrues at a type of country that is able to prescribe antibodies so much where that starts to become a problem. So we think that the kind of first movers to create this problem are Western countries, and it is unfair to ask developing countries now to bear the cost of that. Second reason is that the cost to developing nations is just so high. There is the potential chance that you might stop an existential threat in the future, but the cost in the meantime now is that you have to risk your crops to being invaded and destroyed by pests in order to be able to push that away. Oh, do you want to say that there is the cost of being destroyed by ecological disaster in the future? But we'd ask them to be comparative, to compare this to the very real cost of having your crops destroyed in the now because you are unable to use the pesticides to ward off the pests that you know present a threat to you. What's important to note here is that the West can plug the gap with this. They can provide the types of antibodies and the type of pest controls that can help keep developing countries stable. And also, it doesn't pose as much of an existential threat to them. Because if the West loses one type of crop in one type of industry, they have advanced markets that can plug the gap and ensure that their populations can be fed. Whereas if in developing nations, one particular type of crop becomes wiped out by a pest because they were unable to use those pesticides, that represents a real cost and potentiality for famine that can occur in those countries. Similarly, and this is the third point in principle, it's that it's not likely the over-catering of these things is likely to lead to epidemics. Because in the West, you have greater developed things like sanitation and healthcare, which means you are less likely to cause the kinds of problems that we're talking about in this debate. Overall, the costs of complying with this policy are too high for these developing nations to be able to occur, and seeing as the West created this problem, we just do not think that it is fair enough for them to ask developing nations to be able to solve it. European government wants to talk about the costs and problems of short-termism, but we think that short-termism is just as much a global problem as it is an individual problem. Because the problems of and the cost of a superbug accruing and developing to the rest of the world is just the same as when it accrues to you as an individual or your family. Which means that the problem here is not whether or not you have the capacity as a developing nation to be able to foresee in the desire to, as a developing nation to see in the future and anticipate these things. It's whether or not you have the capacity to be able to do so. And it is clear that these developing nations do not have the capacity to be able to do so, and therefore it is unjust for them to ask them to. I'll go on to 2 points of that, but before I will take a point from closing.
Isn't this very argument about how developing countries don't have the money to overuse antibiotics and thus aren't contributing to resistance the same reason that they aren't overusing or like even able to use things like pesticides, such that the cost of this regulation don't fall on them?
Okay, I think that's no, because I think that you can have some amount of money in order to be able to afford pesticides for a crop industry, but then not have enough money to be able to have the advanced market mechanisms to be able to cover for the problems that occur when one particular crop industry fails and you have to cover for the rest of your populations. The scales that we're talking about there are completely different, and that point really doesn't make a lot of sense. So, why are these countries structurally unable to be able to do things like that? In order for this policy to be effective, you need to have kind of strict regulations and strict medical bureaucracies in order to be able to implement it. What that looks like is that, for example, in order to be able to ensure that you are not prescribing antibodies, you need to have some sort of advanced medical history that shows whether or not someone has been prescribed an antibody before. That means you need things like hospitals that can hold advanced medical records. That means that you need strict sort of advanced guidelines for prescribing when a disease is appropriate to prescribe a particular antibody for. None of these things exist in countries that are still trying to develop and just distribute basic medicine to people within their populations. The second reason they are structurally unable to implement this policy is because there is a supply and medicine availability problem. So oftentimes, the reason why this threat accrues in the first place is because these countries may only have access to one type of antibody, and prescribing it to their population happens because it's better to give people some chance of surviving whatever disease that they're currently faced with, as opposed to no chance whatsoever. Asking these countries to forego any sort of treatment at all to these people, merely for the sake of trying to avoid some existential threat, is simply unjust. Lastly, what are the impacts that we think is going to happen is that these countries are just likely to leave the WHO. If it is the case that opening government claims that these countries are simply short-termist and don't care about longer problems, we think that is the exact sort of reason why they are not going to care about these punitive actions in the first place. Firstly, because it is much harder to sell something like, potential future food security threat or the potential existential risk of superbugs to a population that has much more immediate and pressing concerns like just a stable food supply and agency and whether or not you can get any sort of healthcare at all. We think that it is much more likely that these governments are going to yield to the will of that population and just leave the WHO and not comply with these things. Also, the second thing is that these institutions like the WHO are already viewed as very Western-centric, as already cared as not caring as much about the needs of these developing countries. And I think that these kinds of exact policies, where you basically hold these countries hostage and say, you need to do what is in the interest of the West, otherwise we're going to cut off your support, is the exact type of thing that's able to perpetuate that. That means that all of the stuff that the WHO does that is currently good gets avoided. You don't get the kind of data recognition, you don't get the kind of distribution of important medical services they do provide, you just make life worse for the most vulnerable actors. And for that reason, we think this is an unjust policy that we are very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. That's going to go to the bench.
Oh, yes. The biggest problem we get from opening opposition is, can we implement this, because we're not sure if the developing world has sufficient medical resources. We think the images we bring in from opening government still obviously stands in this debate at the point at which we can implement best practices globally through the World Health Organization. Because that was a context we were missing in this debate, which was the fact that when we have all of these resources in member countries who are able to implement and distribute resources that enables best practice, that is the point at which we get the outcomes that we are achieving. The problem we identify is that Western countries have no incentive to do this under the status quo because they are pandering to electoral incentives and pandering to people who want to go to the doctor and get antibiotics and feel secure, even if they do not recognise the long-term harms that will bring to their grandchildren as a result of that pandering. They do not recognise that in 10 years or 15 years that superbug will wipe out that city, or worse, wipe out cities who do not have that initial resistance in the first place before they get there. That is the problem that we fix from opening government still stands in this debate at the point at which we have no response. I'm going to do two questions from let me put this way. Two questions in rebuttal. First, regarding the West and whether or not we're ever going to achieve this organically, I would say there was no structural mechanisms for why they will get there, but I will prove to you why we will never get there. And secondly, regarding some of this scaremongering and why this really isn't going to be as bad as they say. To the first though, they claim that Western governments and organisations have an incentive to do this under the status quo, and they are largely achieving this. The first thing I would contend is that they are achieving this at any point in this debate. I would say that the opioid crisis is indicative of the fact that Western countries do not care for their populace as much as they want to contend, and rather care about things like short-term pain relief at the cost of long-term actual cures and things that assist them. But secondly, I would say they naturally aren't achieving these things. The problem is that they have to recognise is that superflus every year are generated by Western countries who develop more and more resistance each year, and those flus make the rest of the world are fatal in the rest of the world and exist across state borders because the West are doing this because of their incentives to their own people. I think there are structural reasons that we point to at opening government, which means governments have no incentive to implement the kind of change that we're seeking. What are we talking about? Electoral pressure from their populace means that they do not want to implement tough-on prescription lobbies or anything like that, at the point at which people do want to feel safe, they do want to feel that they will be protected. But also, I would add a second reason here, which is to say at the point at which Big Pharma spends 75% on their revenue on lobbying governments and on lobbying doctors and health organisations, I would contend that they actually have the political will and the political capture in order to actually get any of the benefits that they want to claim in opening opposition. No, thank you. So those are the reasons why the West actually has no incentive to fix the kind of problems that they themselves are generating and have no obligation to protect the people who are most at risk. That's to say the people who do not have any resistance under status quo because antibiotics are not getting there in the first instance. That still stands from opening opposition. But let's talk about the scaremongering that they wanted to have, because they said that the biggest problem in this debate is that if you are a farmer in the developing country and that is your sole source of income, at the point at which that crop does not succeed because you do not use pesticides, that is a loss in this debate. To be clear, there are safe ways to implement pesticides, there are safe ways to protect that crop from diseases. The problem under their side of the house is currently you have an indiscriminate drowning of your crop of those pesticides because you think it is better to be safe than sorry, so you medicate plants or whatever in order to achieve that. The problem is that over-medication was very ecologically damaging. How? Those chemicals that go into those plants feed through the rest of the food chain. That means not only is that plant infiltrated, but whatever eats that plant is infiltrated, and so on, to the point at which our marine life is dying across the world because of the amount of chemicals that we are putting into our plants. That was the thing that they had to deal with opening opposition. I think the problem that we are saying is that they're not using it strategically in the way that they will have to do under our side of the house when they have to follow best practice, when they have to use regulation. That means we have those crops succeeding, but without damaging the rest of the environment. But also, the other substantive claim I would say here in response is that Big Pharma has an incentive to bring affordable drugs to the developing world at the point at which they cannot over-prescript in developed countries. That's to say, if there is a natural cap that they can prescribe because they have to subscribe to best practice across the Western world, that means they are more likely to bring those drugs over to places that need them most at more affordable prices in order to capture those markets. 2 points are substantive from me. Firstly, as I may have indicated, around Big Pharma, and secondly, I think I've used most of my comments on the developing world in my rebuttal, and that was integrated. So, regarding Big Pharma, and I'll take a point of information from closing if they have one, under status quo, big pharmaceuticals have huge swathes of political power because they control the supply of drugs, and they do that. The other bigger problem that they have, though, is that they incentivize doctors to overprescribe through things like conventions, through things like donations. They spend huge amounts of money on lobbying on doctors, but also they lobby governments, and governments have no incentive to check that influence because they are reliant on Big Pharma for the supply of those drugs. Where Big Pharma has patents for that drug, you are unable to get it in any other way. I'm taking one from closing if they have one. At the point at which they have they have to patent that Big Pharma in order to get that drug into their country, obviously you need to have them on side. Yes?
The biggest problem with the developing world is not that they have overprescriptions, they don't have enough drugs to begin with, and that people are dying because of it. How can you live with that?
Yeah, okay, I think there are two problems that we identified from opening government. First, there aren't enough prescription medication. I told you why you're more likely to have prescription medication at the point at which Big Pharma has to patent to the developing world in order to capture that market. I would say they have no incentive to do so under status quo because they can simply overprescribe in the Western world and reach their profit incentives in that way, so we increase that incentive at opening government. But secondly, what we were talking about substantively was actually about fertilizers, and that is largely really quite cheap chemicals you are able to distribute across your crops, and that is a problem uniquely because you are unable to actually rectify that outside opposition unless you draw back those chemicals that are being used. So as I said, doctors are prone to pandering to Big Pharma, domestic governments are pandering to Big Pharma. How does the World Health Organization rein that in? I think they are able to limit what and how often prescriptions can prescribe. They create a natural cap, and doctors won't exceed that because of things like professional pressure, but also they understand that they do not want to be responsible for living in a society that doesn't have antibiotics to whooping cough because of the actions that they did. That means they are less likely to prescribe in the first instance, but are less likely to overprescribe at the point at which they have to. But also, I think more and more medications become prescription only when we have these kind of regulations in place. And that is a really good thing because a huge swathe of the population do not need to rely on the drugs that they are currently relying on under status quo, like melatonin to get to sleep, for example, because they think that because they are cash cows for Big Pharma, because the advertising that is implemented across the world means that people think that they have to rely on these drugs. They pump money into Big Pharma when none of that money, none of those drugs were necessary. We think people can't make those decisions for themselves because medicine is quite difficult to understand. Doctors' appointments are incredibly expensive, so they rely on advertising. We reduce the increase the barriers to access for drugs, and that is a good thing because you reduce the profit that is going into big pharma, which reduces things like political lobbying, but also people remain healthier and keep that money in their pocket at the point at which they're not spending money on useless drugs that they never needed in the first instance. Because we enabled diseases never to get to the point at which they wipe us all out, very proud to propose this part of
Thank you very much. Let's close with opening hand.
Speaker, if you've ever been to a doctor or a pharmacy, one thing which you probably didn't know is that your doctor actually had to look at quite specific indicators before deciding what antibiotic. You might not know that amoxicillin is different, for example, to cephalexin, and that doctor, under the types of guidelines which this government wants to impose, was making very precise choices. In the developing world, you might not have access to a doctor who even has the authority to look at those indicators. They might not have access to the types of databases by which those indicators are judged, and that country may not even have the abundance, which the West does, of tons of antibiotics to choose from, and is prescribing you amoxicillin not because it's the best one for your disease, but because it is the only one available, and it will be the difference between life and death for you. The problem with this government bench is that they have just asserted down the bench and misunderstood the types of regulations we are talking about. They are not broken out of malice. They are broken out of lack of capacity. There is no incentive problem, and that is why it would be hilariously unjust to penalise these countries for merely trying to save lives. So I've got a few points in this debate. First one is about a principle. What they say is that the WHO should take on a global view. The problem is that the WHO doesn't need to take on a global view because countries already take on a global view. For example, there is no superbug which could be created in India which only hurts the rest of the world, right? It is the very nature of what they're talking about that any superbug risk has the equal risk of hurting one's own nation as it does the whole world. So this means that incentives in terms of preventing these things actually align. The real question of this debate is, do these nations have the capacity to act? And that is why we think it is unjust to punish them. The second thing we talk about in the second question in this debate then is, will developing nations be able to comply?
Point.
Closing government says developing nations won't be the ones to be breaking the rules because they don't overprescribe antibiotics because they can't afford them. But that misunderstands what these rules actually are. How would you even enforce a rule such as your nation as a whole can't prescribe more than 10,000 amoxicillins, right? That's very hard to do. That's actually a very silly rule. That's why actually it's as opening government talked about. These are point of sale and point of prescription regulations. These are things like, before you can prescribe to a patient, you must have a minimum standard of medical history. You must have a minimum standard of symptom availability. And furthermore, you can't just prescribe any antibiotic, you have to prescribe the right one. Or furthermore, as it is the case in many Western nations, that the type of antibiotic you prescribe actually rotates month to month. So I don't know if anyone knows this, but when you've been prescribed things by your doctor, you might notice that one time you get amoxicillin and the next time you get cephalexin. That wasn't necessarily because it was the right one for your disease, it's just because Western nations already rotate them to prevent antibiotic resistance. Now, what we say is that what this means actually is that developing nations can simultaneously not be contributing to the problem of antibiotic resistance worldwide because they're not able to overprescribe, but will still be breaking the rules because the rules are point of sale and point of regulation because they're the only ones which are feasible. Now, opening government counters this by saying, well, we're going to just provide them with the resources. But we're also going to provide them with the resources that are owed. In fact, our principle says that this is just fair redistribution. The West was the ones who created this problem in the first place. It is their moral obligation to shell out, to make massive sacrifices, for the WTO to be funded primarily by Western nations, and to do its best job to help developing nations. The question then in this debate is, once those resources are provided, is a punitive measure necessary? Why won't these developing nations just do it voluntarily? And that's what brings me to the next question in the debate, which is about incentives. incentives. The first thing, and the real linchpin of open government's case, is they think it's a bit too much like climate change, where, for example, people have to realise a real increase in their electricity bill, and so, there's electoral incentives and things like that. But actually, that's not the case. When a doctor, for example, is very particular about what antibiotic they prescribe you, they're still the same price. If a doctor rotates antibiotics every now and then, as a nation to prevent, for example, the spread of antibiotic resistance, it's actually still the same price. And it's quite technical, right? Like, just think about it. I know because Dad's a pharmacist and I've been getting shit about this since I was a teenager. But actually these problems are so technical and above electoral incentives that because it never actually materialises in a real sacrifice for the average Westerner, it's not a matter of short-term to long-term incentives, it's just a matter of quite technocratic, bureaucratic, over-the-top regulations. And because it never results in an increase in price, it never results in, for example, in a decrease in patient health outcomes, because they're always going to have the choice of at least one of the antibiotics in the West. It isn't a matter of short-term, long-term electoral incentives. But the key thing here is that only Western nations are able to do this voluntarily at the moment, because they are the only ones rich enough to, for example, have very stable medical education services so that all of their doctors have official certificates and have things like registering into a central database, have wide data networks by which they can, for example, collate patient history, have the economic stability to, for example, import 5 different types of antibiotics so that they can be picky and choosy. Developing nations don't have that capacity, and that is why they are, one, currently not complying with these rules, but secondly, structurally will not be able to comply with these rules, even if you try to assist them, and that is why you'll be penalising unfairly. I'll take closing.
Yeah, so the problem with all these arguments is that they're assuming all pharmaceuticals are given to people. What about pharmaceuticals and drugs which are overused in the developed world because they're given to livestock, to farm, and contribute to antibiotic resistance because of the sheer scale of that process?
Yeah, again, same thing, right? So in the West, you can put a regulation on the cattle industry which says year to year you have to change the primary source of antibiotic resistance. So 1 year you have to feed your cattle with, I don't know what the actual technical names for the animal ones are, but you can still switch it, whereas in developing nations they simply don't have the drug availability. So they are forced by lack of choice and lack of capacity to only prescribe the antibiotic because that's the only one they've got. And to hold them to this rule would be to risk their entire livestock, to risk a famine, right, which is the exact problem you guys are trying to solve, but you're just accelerating the process by which it arrives at developing nations' doors. Other thing quickly on the West. I just don't think this policy will ever be effectively enforced in the West, because what is the chance that Pfizer and Big Pharma will refuse to sell to their largest customers? That is never going to happen. This is, like all large bodies like the ICC, going to be something which is uniquely levied against developing nations, because they are the only ones who are not self-sufficient in terms to provide their own drugs. Lastly, opening up has reached Strandy's point about big pharmaceuticals now having an increased incentive to develop drugs and sell them to developing nations. We say this. That is not true because, again, they fundamentally misunderstand the ways in which big pharma can make money. They can make money in the West while complying with the rules, as they have done for decades, because they just simply change which antibiotic they sell, and they overall make the same amount of sales. If you ban them from selling in developing nations, they might be willing to do that just to save face, and that is the problem. That is why you increase the risks of epidemics like cholera, that is why you increase the risks of things like famine in developing nations, or you encourage them to leave the WHO and lose those benefits there, which is why we are very proud to oppose this motion.
Thank you very much. Let's open the second half of this debate.
Opening government correctly identifies that overuse of antibiotics is a global problem, but they are far weaker at identifying why WHO sanctions is the best mechanism to handle it. On closing government, we will be the first team to identify the various relevant stakeholders and how the WHO sanctions change each of their incentive structures. Before I get into specific arguments about the agricultural sector as disaggregated from the medical industry, I want to do a few bit of response to OO, saying OG is very weak, it's actually beating what they actually said. Firstly, this is going to overburden the developing world because they're the ones who are uniquely going to be hit by this. Firstly, this is inaccurate. The issue in the status quo is primarily in agriculture with the overprescription of the preemptive use in factory farms. Why is this number one? Because agriculture is dramatically a larger user of antibiotics than medical use because there are literally tens of billions of, say, chickens and cows and pigs that are given each stage daily as opposed to a few billion people who use it maybe once a year. More importantly, they're used preemptively in a way humans don't use it preemptively. That is because factory farm chickens which so close together, it is very hard retroactively to figure out who has the starter of disease, so you use it preemptively. That is to say, the use is almost certainly, in the use case here, in the agricultural sector, not in the medical sector, as they talk about, so arguments about the agricultural sector are more important. But secondly, the small-scale pharmacist that OO stakes their entire case on is unlikely to trigger full WHO anger, because one, the WHO is unlikely to know about these small-scale pharmacists, as opposed to, say, the West Virginia doctor overprescribing 30,000 different opioids to 30,000 people, and they're unlikely to show up in aggregate statistics. So the argument that someone in, like, say, rural Zambia is going to suddenly trigger the enormous wrath of the WHO is a massive mischaracterization of what OG brought you. But maybe to be charitable, they say the WHO is going to pose these ridiculously intrusive standards, having these massive diagnostic tests in order to trigger the actual help. One, this is massively uncharitable to OG's model. They never say that there's going to be these massive conditions that you need to meet. If it is that you cannot afford diagnostic tests in an entire country, it's unlikely the WHO is going to oppose it. Mainly because the WHO's main membership is single vote per country is unlikely to tolerate those kinds of things. This is uncharitable and inaccurate.
On this.
But, no thank you. But let's say it is. Let's say this is true. Then the pharmaceutical industry who have an interest in using loss-leading diagnostic tests, that is, you sell the diagnostic test that is necessary to prescribe the antibiotics, at a loss in order to make that up on the fact that you could sell the antibiotics. This kind of loss-leading strategy is super frequent in diagnostic tests all over the world. Moreover, the response that they only have one kind of antibiotic in much of the developing world is dramatically inaccurate. There are tons of different generics that are offered at low prices, like AstraZeneca and like Bayer. No, thank you. The argument that they also never beat is why won't these countries leave the WHO or Pfizer will just ignore these things? OG misses this argument. 3 reasons. One, these companies and countries want to avoid the enormous backlash of ignoring the WHO because 190 different countries all are in the WHO. Secondly, big businesses don't want international supply chains to be threatened by any individual country, often those who are very sensitive to WHO, such as those in Europe. And doctors are super influential, given how supply chains for pharmaceutical production is very much international. They are all very likely to comply. Thirdly, they don't want to jeopardize the assistance WHO provides in other forms of crises like Ebola, so they're unlikely to do so. Now to the heart of the extension.
What information?
No, thank you. We think that the agricultural sector is the most important, and this is disproportionately used in the rich world, so you need upfront costs and scale to be profitable to preemptively use things such as pesticides, antibiotics, and talk about. But even when it is used in the developing world, it's important to disaggregate within it. It's not the small-scale, just above subsistence farmer who's using massive use of antibiotics. It's the major agribusinesses who, in the post-1990s creation of WTO, went into the developing world and set up, say, massive farms owned by Cargill, or the, say, palm plantations that dominate much of Indonesia. It's not the small-scale farmers using it, but within the developing world, the kind of farms that are using it are overwhelmingly major agribusinesses whose owners in the West, their profits go to the West and mainly harmed it. Why? Moreover, unfettered access to antibiotics is essential to sustain a very specific kind of profit model. Not small-scale farms, specifically factory farms, because those require preemptive use because it's often too late when noticing it. We think factory farming would lose its relative advantage vis-a-vis small-scale, more free-range farming in a world in which they could not use antibiotics as aggressively. Why is this so important? No thank you. First, this is best for the poorest in the developing world who are those just above subsistence level small-scale farmers, because currently the developed world is flooding their small markets with enormous amounts of really cheap things produced in extremely small spaces like battery cages for hens, and within their domestic markets by the major foreign-owned multinational agribusiness companies who are doing so. These small-scale farmers who aren't using it or are unlikely to fall under the purview of the WTO are crowded out, and their ability to access drugs itself are higher because they have more income to do so, start being crowded out by evil Cargill and Tyson. But secondly, this is probably better for animal welfare, the fact that they are no longer in battery cages. This is, if you want to talk about impact, billions and billions, at least somewhat sentient beings, no longer facing enormous suffering is at least an impact to consider that we brought you on teaching. But finally, this is the most important, will answer a lot of the concerns brought by opening opposition. This is going to lower the cost of antibiotics dramatically. Why? When 95% of antibiotics is being used for unnecessary agricultural use because it's being preemptively used in factory farms where they quite literally have billions of chickens in a single warehouse in Tennessee, what does this mean for antibiotic use for humans? It's dramatically more expensive because if the supply function is constant, but demand is dramatically higher because of overuse agriculture, I'll take you in a second. Yeah, it's going to be a lot more expensive to purchase it because you're competing against billions and billions of uses in the agricultural sector.
The supply factor is obviously not constant because then they just will cease making as much antibiotics, and so the cost will increase across the board. But also, generics are relevant because it's just a brand name. If they're using a different generic, they're still contributing to the problem because they're using the same underlying molecule.
Yeah, so the fact about generics is irrelevant. Our point was that there are multiple different kinds of generics, like AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Bayer, all provide different ones, so the argument about monopolies in the developing world is inaccurate. But secondly, yeah, they're going to decrease amounts because the demand falls by 95% or 90%. Yeah, the supply, they don't need to supply as much because there's literally less demand. But the fact is, when the largest buyer of your product no longer buys it, it is trivially true that it is going to be cheaper for the remainder buyers to buy it. Often also because there's a baked-in effect that they've already produced an enormous amount. Supply chains and contracts are locked in. They have a huge amount of supply. They're going to sell it at a dramatically cheaper price to make sure they don't sell it at all. This means, if you want to talk about how the poor people in rural areas have no access to drugs, yeah, it's because frickin' Monsanto is buying up so much of it, making it functionally impossible for them to compete. This helps small-scale farmers. This helps the people being able to access the multiple different kinds of various different, like 7-syllable drugs that the DLO talked about. This is dramatically better for the poor of the world. Final agent that we want to disaggregate here are hospitals and medical sector around the world. Two warrants that are unique from opening government will provide. Firstly, there's a collective action problem because individuals can shop between doctors. This is especially true under single payer systems, but also places where you have affordable health insurance like in the United States. That is, if someone doesn't prescribe opioids, you literally go to another doctor who does prescribe the opioids. But in the status quo, hospitals do not mind this kind of overprescription because that just means greater demand for their services. But now, good doctors who aren't overprescribing and hospitals want to crack down on the individual bad actors to maintain their supply chain. If they credibly believe that their international supply chains or the provider of other antibiotics are threatened by the presence of individual bad actors under their geographic purview, they're likely to hold their peers and other people underneath their services accountable for doing so. This means we don't even need the WHO as the overdog cracking down. We have on-the-ground agents who are much more familiar with the area cracking down, maintaining a better form of solvency than anything we got from OG. We think OO missed the debate, and OG was not specific enough in their mechanism. We provided you the most accurate characterization of the world. Super proud to stand on closing government.
Thank you very much, and now we're going to open the case for the final Q in this round.
Your health and your food is the basic necessity for every human being. At the point where both government teams lose this debate is when they only focus on governments and will governments implement this or not, whilst not focusing on farmers and individuals who in desperate times of need are going to seek other solutions if they don't have the alternative for this medication and for this pesticide. We're going to claim that this is why drug wars are ineffective. This is why banning alcohol is ineffective, because the demands for these things are so high that regardless of any ban, they will still have a demand, they will still have a supplier. On our side of the house, there will be the black market, and we will win this debate easily. So what do we support? We support educating the farmers, educating the governments on the potential risks and benefits of using and not using this sort of situation. We also support helping them out if they want to implement a higher standard on their own in this sort of situation. We also support offering them replacements, offering them help and support. This is everything that can be very symmetrical for both sides of the opposition. But we do not support and never will support banning a certain thing, because this is the least effective way to actually deal with the problem at hand. This is what we saw with the crisis of opioids and drugs, where people are going behind the scene in these sort of situations. So piece of context. When are people using these drugs? People are not idiots who are just using it out of the sheer wanting to use the drugs. They're using it either when the alternatives for their problem do not exist, or when the alternatives are prohibitively costly, so they cannot afford or it will ruin their lives in these sort of situations. So we say that the impacts of governments are minute in this sort of situation. They might comply, they might not comply. But rather individual farmers' decision and what they decide on their livelihood, which means that if your farm, if you do not succeed in this thing, your children are going to starve in this sort of situation, is something that is going to bring them to use these things anyway. So characterization of farmers. Believe it or not, when it comes to your livelihood and when it comes to your health, people are very much informed. This is why WebMD is a very popular site, and we all think we got cancer when we got a cough in this sort of situation. Specifically because people are scared, people do not want to die in this sort of situation. But the government shows a very great, characterization of how to best use these people in this sort of situation. With a very patronizing way, that they're very stupid idiots who just pump their cows with whatever, not knowing what the trade-offs are. They really do know what the trade-offs are, and despite these trade-offs, they're deciding to go with it in this sort of situation. They know that there is a potential risk that in the future they might not have something, and this is why they're not overusing this and not doing this sort of scorched earth. If you fuck up your soil, you have to live with this soil with nobody willing to buy your soil to begin with in this sort of situation. People are not idiots, and this is why they lose the debate. So this is why we think broad policy is the worst thing. Like people individually choosing to do something, broad policy does not target that. Broad policy has to target everybody in the world, whilst not accounting for the specific context and needs of specific farmers in specific countries. This is why this is a problematic. So they're trying to say that big pharma, and this is a counter argument towards that, so the positive material. So the biggest problem with them is that diseases in the developing world and bacteria, we knew when we had to check for yellow fever entering here, are different than the diseases plaguing the developed world in this sort of situation. And there is already a little, little incentive for big pharma to go and research drugs for, the developing world. Because the margins are not great in this sort of situation. Your shareholders do not want to invest in something that's going to have a high cost of production with low margins with a chance to fail. In this sort of scenario, it's even worse. Because now, if your drug and your drug that you research can fall under this ban, this necessarily then means that you have even higher risk of researching anything from the developed world, any bacteria in this sort of situation. So right now, you might have one solution. In the future for these diseases, you will have even less solutions to begin with, because big pharma, who is the bad guy in this sort of situation, is not going to give you money to research and do stuff, which means that the diseases that are plaguing the developing world are going to stay in awful conditions and awful stuff. This is a risk that we're not willing to take. So they're trying to say that, small farmers are now going to be able to compete. The problem is, small farmers are not competing by pumping the medicine with the large farmers and small farmers inside of the country. No, they're competing with the large farmers from Netherlands, where they have enough technology to not be even wanting and needing to use, these antibiotics and stuff to begin with in this sort of situation. The problematic thing is, these people in the developed world are all in the European Union with their, protectionist policies, is already fucking them up and making them actually, be needing to do this in order to compete on the global market. It's not small farmers. The small farmers are going to get run down by Dutch companies. I'm sorry that I hate Dutch companies in this sort of situation. So we believe, and then lastly, they're trying to say sell it cheaper. Okay, black market. So when we banned crystal meth, crystal meth disappeared, right? No. Of course not. The people, if you have a demand for a certain thing, people are willing to produce it in this sort of situation. People have the demand for their crops not dying and for their child not dying of a preventable disease. This necessarily means that the people are going to be willing to supply this in a state, especially if the state is too weak to combat stuff like cartels, like they are in the developing world, in this sort of situation, criminal gangs. This is bad for a couple of reasons. First of all, no transparency. You do not necessarily know what you're getting. And this is where you get your cocaine mixed with a lot of stuff, but not just cocaine, fuck that. But you get a lot of drugs that are not tested, that are not necessarily know what they are in this sort of situation, which means that all of the harms that they're trying to say of superbugs, which are actually theoretical concept at this moment, just like AI supremacy in this sort of situation, is something that can be even more dangerous towards your crop in this sort of situation, just by the fact that you're not knowing what you're getting into, whilst on our side of the house you can make a rational rational choice by demanding the trade-off in this sort of situation. But also it means not asking for help when push comes to shove and when shitty things happen of people, because you're afraid that you're going to be labeled as somebody who broke the law and who's going to have their things taken away from them. This all means that people, and like in comparison to Monsanto, to how to say, cartels and people who are supplying this, Monsanto is the most transparent company in the world, even though that's shitty in this sort of situation, because we can hold Monsanto accountable, whilst cartels we have to shoot because they will shoot us back in this sort of situation. This is the problem that they're missing. It's not that the governments are or are not going to, how do you say, implement this. It's that government do not have the capacity to take the food away from their people, and there's always going to exist somebody who's willing to provide this service if you ban this on a broad way. We brought to you that Pharma is going to have less chance to research and develop these things, and we brought to you black market. If they don't engage in straw man, it's like every fucking EPL team did this tournament, they're going to lose this debate. Please vote closing opposition.
I thank our speaker very much for that speech, and now invite the dog whip to the stage. Close out the event.
The round in which the opening opposition wanted to hang their whole case on the developing world, I think it's really shocking that only we were the team to impact out why the developing world is less likely to be the developing world on our side of the house. Which is to say, why are their businesses going to compete? Why are their people going to get hired? And why is there going to be money in their pockets? Because our side of the house dramatically lessens the ability of factory farms in the West and the developed world to crowd out their industries and make it impossible for them to compete on the international stage. This is how the developing world ceases to be developing, and this is why we take this debate. Because even outside of questions of antibiotic resistance, if fewer people are dying of poverty, we think we should win this round. I'm going to talk about this resistance, and then I'm going to talk about the developing world. But before that, I want to do some rebuttal to what we just heard out of the closing opposition. So first on this idea of the black market. Like, look, the reason this is an unpersuasive argument is just their own examples. Guys, do you think people would use more or less crystal meth if it was banned and it only operated on the black market? If this is their mechanism as to why antibiotic resistance doesn't happen, clearly it disproves itself at the point which fewer people are going to get sniffly and then go to a drug dealer in the back alley behind their house in order to get like Sudafed or something because they are scared they're going to die of this illness. Clearly people are turned off from black markets. Furthermore, though, major drug companies hate black market dealers because they undercut their market. They would use their lobbying power, which every team in this round has acknowledged, to make these things very hard to exist and to crush down on these things. But more importantly, given that they would still be selling these drugs, this is an argument for our impact, which is that they would lower costs to crowd these black markets out. This is clearly a silly argument, especially at the point at which many consumers hate black markets and doctors don't want to like lose their license by prescribing this stuff. The other thing that they talk about is like less research. So two things to note here. First, at the point in which this is at the point in which much of research goes into things which are more groundbreaking, like say new cancer drugs and this sort of thing, I think it's highly unlikely that companies wouldn't research it because they think that this thing could be banned, because they know what they're trying to research and they know whether this is something which could be like a flooding the market drug, which could contribute to antibiotic resistance. For like at the point in which a cancer drug would be used by a very small share of the population, it clearly wouldn't contribute to resistance, so they clearly could know that this drug wouldn't be banned. But more importantly, we're only banning the misapplication of them. So again, this is very unlikely going to stop wholesale research, but finally, even if we do have to fight some research laws, we are fine with this at the point at which people have jobs on our side of the house, the developing world has more money on our side of the house, and fewer people die of superbugs on our side of the house. Lastly, on this idea of educating people. The problem with this argument is the same problem that OO suffered from, which is just like, people know superbugs are a thing in the status quo by their own example. The thing, and I'm shocked OG didn't say this, is that superbugs and antibiotic resistance is a harm which is externalized, and the benefits to aiding antibiotic resistance is an internalized one. That is to say, the argument we instantiate for you, like hospitals liking it when people overprescribe their drug because you shop around for doctors and you want to get the doctor who will give you that resistance, puts more money in hospital pockets. This is why they compete with it. Giving them knowledge is insufficient, and if this is their mechanism, they get no efficacy. Great. Let's talk now about antibiotic resistance. We told you this is most exacerbated by livestock use for a number of reasons. Note, this is what most meaningfully impacts the arguments opening government is going for. Because when they talk about prescriptions, they're talking about the wrong cause of this resistance. Why? First, agriculture and livestock is so big panel. Literally, they're the tens of billions of chickens alone, and at the point in which all of the factory farms in the West who can compete by giving antibiotics to these chickens because they need to, because they live in such close quarters that the only way to keep them healthy is to give them preventative medicine. This is what most exacerbates antibiotic resistance. But more importantly, it is something which you need to do daily. This is why the developing world can't meaningfully compete on this. Because even if they can afford some antibiotics, they can't afford enough to give it to hundreds of thousands or hundreds of millions of livestock. And in this regard, they cannot compete. This is something which is monotonic, which is to say it's always increasing in efficacy as you use more of it. In the West, you always have incentives to give more antibiotics to your animals because it always makes them safer in the international community. The way in which they try to get back at this is talking about how like the developing world can't compete on either side of the house. But again, this is missing the argument, which is to say, in the West, you always have incentives to go through this method and you flood the international markets and make it impossible for someone without the capital to invest in these methods to compete simply because they don't have the scale to lower costs to do this. The meaningful response which we might get out of the whip, even though they didn't engage with it in extensions, like maybe food costs are going to go down. But I think this is a little silly at the point at which it's far more likely people just switch to things like grains, etc. And this is only certain sorts of meat. What is the impact, though? The developing world is benefited. So ultimately, what ends up happening then is that there also going to be not only a switch to these farming methods, which vastly reduce antibiotic resistance on our side of the house, is the clearest mechanism to it. There are also lower antibiotic costs for the mechanisms Will instantiates for you. So note here, if it's the case that these markets are monopolistic, as they say, and they'll just raise prices, it's unclear why they wouldn't have raised prices to the maximum they could in the status quo. What we told you is that when you remove the largest driver of demand in what is relatively competitive markets for these generics, they have to lower prices because there's a lot fewer people who want to buy this drug and need to compete on this demand. This is why antibiotic costs go down, and even if this wasn't the reason, competing with the black market, which CO gives you as an argument, is another reason these costs go down. This is not only good for just general people, it's good for the developing world, and this is why we take that argument as well.
Big Western agricultural companies already do things like diversify antibiotic molecules because, believe it or not, they don't want to go out of business in 20 years when a superbug wipes out their entire business plan. Why is it just to punish the farmers in developing nations who simply can't afford to do that because their country only has access to one type of molecule?
Okay, again, the problem is that just varying the drug you're using doesn't stop it from contributing to antibiotic resistance. Because guess what? There are a good amount of generics out there, but you steadily wear away the efficacy of any one of them by switching them every year. That still contributes to it. Our argument is that these factory farms can't exist at all because you will not be able to use antibiotics in this preventative way on our side of the house, which is how they're used in factory farms. Let's talk developing world then. Why are they better off? Because their farming is a more profitable business, and the huge barrier to entry in the international, like say, meat industry or agriculture industry of needing things like huge sums of antibiotics goes down. This means people are literally employed more on our side of the house because industries can compete internationally. People have money on our side of the house. People are not dying in the street on our side of the house. Look, I think the conception we get of the developing world from OO is a little facetious, where they're just like, they can't afford more than one drug, guys. I think Will's response is obviously true at the point where there are multiple generics with multiple molecular makeups, such that they're able to do these sorts of things. What does change for them, though, is the massive advantage in the international market which the developing world, or the developed world has, goes away, and they can compete internationally. This means they're no longer developing, and their industries can thrive far more comparatively on our side of the house. That is why we're so proud.
Thank you very much. We're now going to close out this video by listening to the opposition whip.
Octofinal. The government in the developed world are complying to these standards without this ban, because of the push from the population to do it, and people feeling environmentally aware. This is why the CG point makes no sense, and this is about the developing world as debate in whole. So, next, this is like they are giving to us a case like that the moment when we actually introduce this ban, that there's going to be like a massive change. The thing is, it's not going to happen that massive. Why is that? First, demand is high. In the moment when you have demand that is so high, you will find as a person a way to actually acquire it. Why this is so problematic? This is so problematic because then you're asking yourself to the black markets. What is the problem with the black markets? The problem with the black market is let's say that at the best case scenario, it's going to be just subsidized. At the worst of it is, there are going to be people who are pretending literally that they are creators of something like that is the same, that has the same effect, which can be so dreadfully dangerous that can literally poison and kill people. How this actually logic applies? Taking in consideration the drug market. So when you're selling illegal drugs, etc., often the people who are using it are actually deluded because they are told that they are buying some kind of, let's say, heroin, etc. The problem is often those substances actually are mixed up with different types of substances, which are dreadfully bad for the people. So in these kind of situations, we don't have any checks and balances. What is actually coming inside? Why do people who actually decide to go for this? The moment when you actually ban them access to these kind of things, this is the moment when you put them to the very dangerous position. In the moment when your child is dying, when you don't have nothing to feed him, you go to the only solution that you can. So we believe that this is so much dreadful that it just doesn't work. So furthermore, more famine. The moment when you actually ban these pesticides, etc., that is the moment when you actually literally limiting these people any possible access to the things that they can use. We need to take in accountability in account that these people are very poor, coming from developing countries, etc. They cannot afford, in compared to West, these kind of highly expensive drugs. But furthermore, like the moment when you actually introduce this black market to this ban, often the governments and the checks and balance system inside those countries doesn't work. If the people do actually don't get the organic change and they don't understand why this is so much important, that is the moment when you actually have even the government not working their jobs. Taking account what we're taking into account that we are talking about developing society as it is. So let's go to my three clash points in this debate. First clash point in this debate are the checks and balances. Second, the drug access and the research, and thirdly, how the change will actually happen. Taking account that the governments are accountable to their people, the governments are accountable to the things that are happening, and the governments do actually the best thing they can do in the situation that is happening right now. So we need to take in account that the governments do actually act on the present situation. In the moment when we have actually the famine, in the moment when we have like really bad situation, the government's doing everything they can to help their people. So the thing is also that the government's that the membership in the Voluntary trade organization, etc., is voluntary. The moment that the governments are so much high problems, they are applying to the people. So what is the problem with this? The problem is that the moment when we actually don't help our people, that is the moment when people will go against. This is the moment when we actually have the black market flourishing, when we have the people going away. But we believe that the governments do care about the people, and the people as itself do care about themselves. Take into account when Miller said, you're not going to do, you're literally going to save your children, you're going to do the best. The people are aware of the problems. The only thing that we need to do is to push more education, etc., and that is the moment when we do actually get the change that we are actually needed, because the people want the best for themselves, people want the best for their children, but the only way that we can achieve this is through organic change, of people getting educated, people accepting this because it's good for them, and not just running away. It is not true that people people are just like externalizing the problems that are happening. People are very much aware of the problems that are happening, and people do take them in account. The problem is that often these people are not educated enough, not explained enough how these things works and why it is so much problematic. And the moment when you actually grow that, the people will change. Second of all, drug access and research. So we need to understand several things. Firstly, in order drugs are often needed newly. So we need new drugs to combat new kind of diseases, etc. The thing is, in the moment when you actually ban in these kind of countries the sales of these drugs, etc., the government, the big pharma companies, and this is directly clashing to the case. Big pharma companies lose their interest in these kind of researchers. Why is that? Often developing countries have unique diseases and problems for those countries. The moment that you actually run their activity on these kind of markets, they just don't see the benefits of investing the money in the research. The moment when they lose the moment when they actually the moment of interest in their research, that is the moment when you're leaving literally the whole countries without supply of the medicines that is so much needed for them to survive, that you're literally creating the bigger problem that it was before they go closing. They go opening, sorry.
The problem wasn't a lack of education, it was a lobbying from big pharma, it was electoral incentives and better safe than sorry attitudes from farmers and doctors. We still haven't heard how you deconstruct antibiotic resistance and protect millions of people from superbugs. Can you provide that at closing opposition?
We prevent them by education and people change. The governments are accountable to their people, not to the big pharma. But the moment when you explain to the person how they are destroying their families, how they are destroying soil, that is the moment when they rebel. And the governments care more about their positions than the influence of the big pharma. So the moment, so the less research leads to the bigger problems, and we believe that the problems with the less research and the medicines for treated are much bigger problems than the problem that they are bringing to us, like it's going to bring to us. So thirdly, how this actually change happens. And you recognize this, that Miloš is the only person who actually tells you how people do actually change and why people are accountable and therefore the government as itself. So people do care about their families, people do care about their long-term environment, etc. Why? Because in 10 to 15 years they need to work on this land. In 10 to 15 years they need to have the accountability for their families, etc. And because of all of these incentives, the people do change their opinion and people do care about this kind of stuff. And because of this, the big oppose this notion.
One final statement.